Here's Greg Kukul to give a pretty confusing explanation of what happens to people who never get to hear about Jesus.
Is free will, is it reasonable or fair if God knows that somebody's going to be in a circumstance that those circumstances will not incline them towards the gospel? Is it fair for them?
Jesus said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So if you believe in Jesus, you get to go to heaven, but only if you believe in Jesus. Assuming, of course, that coming unto the Father is the same thing as getting into heaven. This presents an obvious problem. What if you've never heard of Jesus? What if you died before Jesus was ever born? What if you live somewhere that no missionary has ever reached? And because God has infallible foreknowledge of everything that will happen, since there are people who never hear about Jesus, doesn't that mean that he created billions of people who he knew would never have any chance of getting into heaven? That doesn't sound very loving, does it?
And this is something that different people, I mentioned, satisfy or solve in different ways. Now, there is a verse in Acts, and I don't have it right in front of me here, but you might be familiar with it. I think it's when Paul's in Athens, and where he, maybe on the Areopagus, where he says that God has placed people in the world in such a way as they will have the best opportunity to know God if they would seek and find him, though he's not far from them.
How does that work if the only way to the Father is through Jesus and there have been billions of people living in times and places in which that's impossible? And if it is possible to get into heaven without ever having heard of Jesus, then why are Christians commanded to teach about him?
Okay, so what that suggests is God is concerned with people knowing him and maximizing the circumstances in which that's the case.
Well, given that he's all-powerful, he could maximize the circumstances of salvation by magically beaming information about Jesus into everyone's brains at birth. They'd still have the free will to reject his salvation, but at least they'd be guaranteed to know it's an option. Failing that, how does God maximize the circumstances of a person believing in Jesus if that person died long before Jesus was ever even born?
That they would know him. However, there is also this other factor. And that other factor is there are people who, no matter what circumstances they're going to be in, are not going to respond to the gospel.
Yeah, but what does that have to do with the folks who would have accepted the gospel had they heard it, but just didn't have the chance to hear it? Are we to believe that every person who never had a chance to hear the gospel would have rejected it if they did hear it? Do you believe that every single pre-Columbian inhabitant of the Americas would have rejected Jesus, and it was only once the missionaries started showing up that the first convertible indigenous people on the entire continent just happened to appear? That's a weird coincidence.
And if they respond, or if they reject the gospel, they do so, or they reject whatever knowledge of God is apparent to them. And in Romans 1, that part of the argument there is that everybody has the knowledge of the Father, even though not everybody has the knowledge of the Son.
Yeah, but since the only way anyone cometh unto the Father is through the Son, knowledge of the Father without knowledge of the Son is pretty useless for salvation, isn't it?
And if they reject that, they are culpable.
But again, even if you accept knowledge of the Father, if you don't believe in the Son, even if the only reason you don't believe in the Son is that you've never heard of him, it's still the case that you can't cometh unto the Father. So even many of the folks who accept the Father are still not getting into heaven.
They are without excuse.
But what about the folks who accept the Father but are totally ignorant of the Son, and for that reason don't believe in him? Don't they have a pretty reasonable excuse?
And the grounds for the judgment ultimately is going to be their immoral behavior. And we see that in Revelation 20. And they were each judged according to their deeds.
Then why do so many Christians tell me that a person who doesn't accept Jesus can't get into heaven no matter how good their deeds are? What does the Bible mean when it says that nobody cometh unto the Father without accepting Jesus, if it is in fact the case that people who accept the Father and do good deeds are able to cometh unto the Father without even knowing about Jesus?
So I guess to sum up real quickly here, and then you can come back at me in the last couple of minutes, is that God is concerned. He does, to some degree, adjust the circumstances so people have the best opportunity to get the revelation they need. That's the Acts passage, Areopagus.
To some degree? Is he all-powerful or not? Why wouldn't he adjust the circumstances such that the opportunity to accept Jesus is set to the maximum degree?
But at the same time, people still are going to rebel and still not trust him.
Again, what does that have to do with the ones who don't rebel and would accept Jesus if they had heard about him, but happened to die the year before he was born and therefore never had the chance? And if the only way to cometh unto the Father is believing in Jesus, does that mean that Moses didn't cometh unto the Father? Did Noah not cometh unto the Father? What about Abraham? Were all the best people who lived prior to Jesus' birth denied access to heaven because they never even had the opportunity to believe in Jesus?
And regardless of the level of revelation about Jesus, their rebellion is still blameworthy.
But what if they don't rebel, but still can't cometh unto the Father because they never heard of Jesus?
And so when God punishes the when he punishes the unrighteous, he is not unjust, even if no message of salvation has been given to them, because God doesn't owe guilty people a pardon.
He doesn't owe guilty people a pardon, but if the only way into heaven is by believing in Jesus, then what happens to the innocent people who never get a chance to hear about him? Some may argue that because of original sin, everyone is born guilty. If that's the case, then it's not about your deeds at all, is it? Or sometimes folks say that you're not born guilty, but original sin gives you a sinful nature that makes it inevitable that you will rebel. Well, if your sinful nature makes rebellion unavoidable, where does free will fit into that? How do you use your free will to choose obedience if your sinful nature guarantees that you won't make that choice? And even when it comes to the guilty people, the central promise of Christianity is that you will be pardoned if you believe in Jesus. How is it fair to grant the opportunity to believe in Jesus to some guilty people, but not all guilty people? How is it fair that the difference between the guilty folks who have the opportunity to believe in Jesus and the guilty folks who don't is that the folks who don't were born in the wrong place at the wrong time? How is that just? And if people are born with a sinful nature that makes it inevitable that they will sin, and God knows beforehand that they will inevitably sin, why create them in the first place? If the answer is that they have the opportunity to accept Jesus, well, that's not the case if they live somewhere that missionaries never reach during their lifetime. Why did God knowingly create billions of doomed people? Do the people who died before Jesus was born stay out of heaven until he was crucified, and then get taken up into heaven afterward? Did they all go to limbo or purgatory? If they were good people who never rebelled against God, how is it just that they had to spend thousands of years in purgatory until Jesus was crucified to get into heaven? And if people can be moved around in the afterlife, why can't people who didn't accept Jesus in their lifetime change their mind and do so after death? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.